Okay, good morning. I'm David Penn, Managing Director of Conquest in the UK, and I'm going to be talking about neuromania and why we need to rehumanize research. Things we're going to be talking about today, three things. Neuroscience, probably heard of that. Neuromarketing, probably heard of that as well. Neuromania, probably haven't heard of that one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is, but just before we get on to it, let's just do a little bit of terminology checking. First of all, what's neuroscience? Neuroscience is the scientific study of the nervous system. It's a very big discipline, very wide area that it covers. What we're primarily interested in as market researchers is what's called cognitive neuroscience. And cognitive neuroscience is the study of how thoughts and feelings are implemented in the brain. Neuromarketing, or what's sometimes called neurometrics, is the use of neuroscientific technologies to measure response to marketing stimuli. So that can be packs, advertising, brands, and so on. So what about neuromania? Well, this was a term actually coined by a neuroscientist stroke philosopher called Raymond Tallis. And what he calls neuromania is the belief that we can explain all our behavior by reference to the brain. Now, I'm going to say at the outset that I don't believe that all neuromarketers are neuromaniacs, or maniacs of any kind. I mean, a lot of my best friends are neuromarketers. But what's of concern and what he's worried about is the tendency for people to explain everything by reference to the brain. And his concern, as we'll come on to talk about, is that it actually makes a fundamental error in terms of understanding what we're about as human beings. Neuromarketing techniques, the ones that you're probably most familiar with are fMRI and EEG. I'm going to focus on those. There's also biometrics. I'm not going to talk about those in detail today because those are essentially secondary measures in the sense that they don't look directly in the brain. So I'm going to talk about fMRI, which is a technique for measuring increased oxygen levels in blood flows within the brain in response to different mental states. EEG, which captures minute electrical signals produced by the brain. fMRI started off very positively in neuromarketing a few years back, and a lot of you are probably aware of a famous experiment that was done by neuroscientists in the US looking at Pepsi versus Coke. And I guess moving on from there, it's a surprise really that fMRI hasn't been used more widely, because it is actually the only neuromarketing technique with sufficiently high spatial resolution to show you and locate activity in specific brain regions. The problems with it are largely logistical. It's hugely expensive, the equipment is not really portable. It's also quite a claustrophobic and stressful respondent experience, and there are legitimate concerns about how that affects the way people respond. There's also a bigger problem, particularly in relation to using it to look at things like advertising, because it does have very poor temporal resolution. What that means is it can take up to 5 seconds for the added blood supply that is activated to reach a certain part of the brain. So often we've got a real lagged effect when we're using fMRI. So what about EEG? Well, as we saw, it captures minute electrical signals produced by the brain, uses much less invasive and more portable equipment than fMRI. And A.K. Pradeep, who set up Neurofocus, tells us that only EEG can provide direct measurement of neurological activity in the brain, registered at the true speed of thought. So there's no time lag, essentially, with EEG. That's all fine. When you look at the academic basis of EEG, what you find is it relies on a model that was developed some time ago that tells us that the left prefrontal cortex is involved in approach behavior, whereas the right prefrontal cortex is involved in withdrawal from aversive stimuli. Now that's often taken to mean that if we see activity in the left prefrontal cortex, that's about positive emotion. If we see it in the right PFC, that's about negative emotion. In reality, EEG actually measures only a very small part of the complex brain circuitry that controls our emotions. And there's a lot of debate about this, actually, how effectively it measures the parts of the brain that are most engaged in emotion. So both fMRI and EEG have a lot of positives, but there are a lot of issues about their use and a lot of issues about their validity particularly in the area of marketing research. Now, you wouldn't know that if you'd read either of these two books. Biology, which is by Martin Lindstrom, who I'm sure you've heard of, and The Buying Brain, which is by someone we've already talked about, A.K. Pradeep. Now, the interesting thing about both of these books is really the extent to which they claim that neuromarketing, either using fMRI or EEG, can fundamentally give us answers that other approaches can't. And there's a quote from Martin Lindstrom here: "I compare advertisers to Christopher Columbus gripping a single map of the Earth he believed to be flat. Thanks to neuromarketing, we're now able to see in an almost Aristotelian shift in thinking. Companies are beginning to realize that the world, in fact, is round." If you read these two books, what's interesting is Buying Brain makes a lot of claims, uses a lot of theoretical assumptions, not very heavy in terms of case studies. Biology has a lot of examples that Lindstrom has generated from his own experimental program, which are very interesting. We're going to talk about one or two of them. The issue, I think, with Lindstrom's work is that if it's as groundbreaking as he claims, I would like to see it written up as a proper academic paper, but we've yet to see that. So we have a situation, really, where I think some quite far-reaching claims are being made for neuromarketing techniques, for our ability to predict and explain consumer behavior purely by looking at what's going on in the brain, either through fMRI or EEG. And I want to talk about, really, whether this is a valid approach. And I've called this section the 8 Fallacies of Neuromania. And the first one really stems from, I think, a misguided belief in evolution theory as the explanation of everything. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a creationist, I'm not anti-Darwin. I think evolution is a fundamental explanation of how we came to be what we are. But the evolution fallacy is this, that because we don't differ fundamentally from higher primates, apart from having a bigger brain, that the differences between us and higher primates are less important than the similarities. Now, I don't know about you, I've never had a conversation with a chimpanzee, never read a book by a chimpanzee, never been to a play that's been performed by a chimpanzee. Now, I've been slightly facetious, but there are fundamental differences in the consciousness that human beings have relative to higher primates. And it's not just a difference of extent, it's a difference of kind. And if we ignore this, we basically ignore the humanity of the people that we're trying to research. The second fallacy is that if we can't see something in the brain, it doesn't exist. Well, actually, there's an awful lot that we can't see in the brain. And to list some of those things, consciousness, we can't see in the brain. The self, we can't see in the brain. A sense of identity, we can't see in the brain. Memory, we can't actually see in the brain very well, although some claim to be able to do it. Just because we can't see the brain activity doesn't mean that it's non-existent. And I don't think even the most neuromaniacal neuroscientist would claim, for example, that consciousness doesn't exist just because they can't see exactly where it is. The third fallacy is about sameness, and I'm going to quote from Martin Lindstrom's book just to illustrate what I mean. And this is after he'd done an experiment where he brain imaged two sets of people. The first set were religious zealots who were shown religious imagery, and the second set were brand loyalists who were shown images of their favorite brands. What he tells us is that, bottom line, there was no discernible difference between the way subjects' brains reacted to powerful brands and the way they reacted to religious icons and figures. Clearly, that's my italics, clearly our emotional engagement with powerful brands shared strong parallels with our feelings about religion. Okay, there are some parallels between the way we feel about great brands and the way that people feel about religion. But again, I don't know anybody who worships at the Church of Apple. I don't know anyone who believes that they will go to Apple heaven when they die. And I hope there's not anyone who believes this, but I don't think there's anyone who believes that Steve Jobs was a deity. The problem here is that what we're saying is just because the brain activity is the same, that the result of the brain activity is the same. Now, clearly, religious experience differs fundamentally in many ways from our feelings about brands. To say that because the brain activity is the same in both cases doesn't mean that the output, the consequence, is the same. And that's a fundamental error in fallacy. And equally, there's a difference fallacy, which is that if we see that different parts of the brain light up when someone looks at different stimuli, we can infer what the subject feels, thinks about one thing rather than another. Now again, the word is infer. All we can do if we look at brain imaging or we look at an EEG trace is make an inference about what people are feeling. It doesn't tell us, now because our knowledge of the brain and its location, the location of different elements in the brain, is not so specific that we can say just because one part of the brain lights up, that is what someone is feeling. And if another part of the brain lights up, people are feeling something fundamentally different. And probably most important of all is the freedom fallacy. It's sometimes claimed that because brain activity can sometimes be observed before we're making a decision, our free will is an illusion, that our brains are in complete control of what we do. Now, this is a philosophical debate. I mean, I don't really want to get into this here because we haven't got time. But a couple of points I'd make is that the strange thing about the brain is that it's the only organ in the body that actually allows itself to be transcended. What I mean by that is that people can stand outside it and make observations of what's going on inside it, which means that actually the brain isn't in control, something else is in control. And we may not have free will, but we definitely do have free won't, because we are able at times to control and limit our behavior. So think about the time when you wanted to hit someone or you uncontrollably wanted to kiss someone and you didn't do it. That was your free won't telling you to do that. And this is something I've heard on a lot of conference platforms recently, what I call the automatic pilot fallacy, that our unconscious emotions compel us to act irrationally instead of working with our rational faculties to facilitate better decision-making. Now, a lot of speakers who talked about behavioral economics have talked about the automatic pilot. The next time someone does that, I may well be compelled by my emotions to jump on the stage and remonstrate with them. Because again, it doesn't actually present a proper picture of how emotions and conscious rational thinking work alongside each other. If you read the work of neuroscientists like Damasio, what Damasio says is that basically emotions help us to make better decisions. They work alongside our rational faculties. They don't drive us uncontrollably, except if we're in the grip of some incredibly strong survival emotion, the fight or flight that sometimes people talk about. And I think Charles Altman has the most considered view when he says decision-making hinges on the simultaneous functioning of reason and emotion. Key word there is simultaneous. And there's also the reductionist fallacy, which we sort of talked about, this idea that we can locate reason and emotion in specific parts of the brain. If you actually look at the structure of the brain, well, actually, the bit that handles emotions and the bit that handles conscious reasoning sit pretty much side by side. The point is they constantly interact. Emotional brain and conscious rational brain talk to each other all the time. And again, I hear people talking about System 1 and System 2 thinking. This is a very simplistic dichotomy of how our brains work. And we come finally to the most important one and probably the most complicated one. And I think this does take a bit of explanation. And I call this the all-in-the-head fallacy. The mistaken belief that thought, feeling, and cognition are all to be found in the brain and not outside it. Now, what do I mean by that? It's pretty obvious if we look at our thinking and feeling and the products that actually come from that, in fact, we share consciousness with other human beings. But what we've done is create a shared space in which human consciousness and human emotions and feelings interact with each other. And you might call this the cognitive community of minds. It's the way in which we as human beings create culture. Now, language is the most literal expression of that. Language is the way in which I'm able to communicate with you now. But interestingly, in the evolution of consciousness, language is quite a latecomer. We'll come on to talk about how our consciousness developed and what that tells us for marketing and marketing research. And the reason I believe this is so fundamental is that it's this evolution of our consciousness that actually goes to the heart, and that's a metaphor for you, goes to the heart of what it means to be human, rather than being, for example, a higher primate. And I've got a quote from a guy I mentioned earlier, Raymond Tallis, neuroscientist and philosopher. Very long quote, but it's really important. Our consciousness cannot be found solely in a standalone brain, or even just in a brain in a body. It participates in and is part of a community of minds built up by conscious human beings over hundreds of thousands of years. This cognitive community is an expression of the collectivization of our experiences through a trillion acts of joint and shared attention. And he heads this, he calls it a trillion cognitive handshakes. It's the coming together of minds that creates a shared consciousness, a community of minds, and a shared culture. And the reason that we're able to do this is because our consciousness has evolved beyond what higher primates have. Higher primates have something called episodic memory. Now, episodic memory is a fairly limited capability. It's the ability to recall specific events, which they then apply pretty much unthinkingly to present circumstances. So, for example, my dogs don't like to get in my car because they associate getting in the car with going to the vet. Now, 99 times out of 100, they don't go to the vet. But I don't seem to be able to explain that to them because basically all they can recall is the one time they went to the vet and they had to get in the car. The thing about episodic memory is it can only be passed on through genetic transmission. There's no way that animals can actually communicate with each other and pass on the things that they've learned. What humans developed is an ability to pass on things that they've learned. And there's a guy called Merlin Donald who wrote a book called The Origins of Consciousness, and he suggested that the most fundamental stage in the development of consciousness is what's called mimesis. And that's the capacity that we developed to communicate with each other non-verbally, without words, and without any language, largely by signing and by miming. And what it gave us the ability was to create a representative form of communication based on gestures and mime. It allowed us to form group structures, it allowed us to display emotions, and also to pass on knowledge. Obviously that evolved into non-verbal representation, and the reason I've got these cave drawings here is they're a pretty good indication of non-verbal representation. Right at the end of the chain of consciousness evolution, a language, symbols. But there's something that a lot of cognitive linguist theory, cognitive linguist analysts believe came in between, and that's metaphor. Now you might be surprised to see that word there because metaphor is normally associated with language. But what metaphor is a capacity to be able to represent one thing in terms of another. And if we think about how we learned to represent one thing in terms of another, we learned it through our experience and our experience in our environment. So if we take a simple metaphor like happy is up, where did we learn that from? Why do we say that we're feeling up or we're feeling down? Well, probably we learned it through observation of mimetic behavior. People jumping up and down when they were happy, people throwing their arms in the air, their smiles turning up at the corners. So metaphor is fundamental to the formation of language. And the reason I believe it's so important is because it's a way of understanding how people feel. So getting away from the philosophy and the theory for a moment, I'm going to show you some song lyrics here. You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire. Now, when Jim Morrison wrote these words, I don't think he was about to commit arson. I think what he was doing was he was using two fundamental metaphors. He was using up as a metaphor for ecstasy, higher, and he was using fire and temperature as a metaphor for passion. And similarly, when Peggy Lee talked about giving me fever, I don't think she was warning us about the dangers of infectious disease. I think she was talking about that flame-like passion that people feel when they're in love. The metaphor seems fundamental to us in terms of our ability to express emotion. That's why in my company we've developed these into actually a research tool, which we've called metaphorics. Now, if you look on the left-hand side of the chart there, you can see a number of expressions. I have a warm relationship. I feel close to him. I jump for joy. Each of those contain a fundamental metaphor. And these are what are called primary metaphors. These are metaphors that actually occur in almost every language and every culture. Now, you look at those and you know automatically what they mean. And what they mean is affection, they mean intimacy, they mean excitement. So if I say I feel close to someone, you know that I'm talking about how I feel about them, not whether I'm in this room in England or you're in another room in Australia. What we've done through metaphorics is to make maximum use of the online space and visualize these metaphors and create visual representations of them that people can actually use to show us how they feel about different stimuli. And it can be advertising, it can be brands, it can be new product concepts. And we've tested this pretty much in every continent now. And what we find is that when we compare our visualized metaphoric scales with verbal scales, if we take brand proximity, for example, if we use a metaphoric representation of that, we get a very different distribution to using a verbal scale. And what it indicates to us is that verbal scales often inhibit response. Language actually gets in the way of expressing emotion. And similarly with our brand warm scale, we see much more use of the top end of the scale than we do with an equivalent verbal scale. And one of the things that we've been able to do with this is actually use it in quite unusual circumstances to get people to show us how they feel, in this case about two politicians. Now, if you're outside the UK, these two guys may not be familiar to you. But this was a study we did for ITN, big news network in the UK, during the mayoral election in London a couple of years ago. Two characters, one called Ken Livingstone, one called Boris Johnson, both highly polarizing. But by putting them on our metaphorical sofa and by getting someone to represent themselves via an avatar, and by moving their avatar either towards or away from that character, we were able to capture quantitatively how they felt. And what we saw was this very highly polarized distribution, which is something you don't normally see in market research. Now, at the point when we did this survey, conventional polls are actually putting these two guys pretty much neck and neck. Ken Livingstone, the guy at the bottom there, was seen as the better candidate on a whole number of dimensions, more experienced, more authoritative, more knowledgeable. The problem is what the polls disguised was the fact that a lot of people hated him. What we picked up was that Boris was polarizing, but emotionally he was engaging the electorate. And we predicted his victory to within 1 percentage point. We're one of only 2 companies in the UK to do that. And we've taken this technique and applied it across a whole range of applications, brands, advertising, new product development, very successfully. So my final thoughts on this. Quote here from a guy called Richard Thorogood, Director of Strategic Insights and Analytics at Colgate-Palmolive. In neuromarketing, there's no E=mc² equation. A lot of good stuff has been done in the neuromarketing arena, but we haven't solved the riddle of human behavior. To rely on the brain entirely to predict what people are going to do just doesn't work. What neuromarketing helps us to understand is the neural correlates of brands and advertising. They allow us to see what's going on in the brain when people are thinking about brands and ads, and that's pretty much it. What we need to understand is that brands are as much cultural constructs as neuronal ones. They exist in the community of minds created by the interaction of our brains, with the society in which they live. And it's there we need to look for the underpinnings of brands. It's there we need to look for the emotional engagement that creates brands. So looking at the brain alone will never give us a complete answer. Looking for our shared humanity just might help us do that. Thank you.